Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer. Buddha at the Gas Pump is an ongoing series of interviews with spiritually awakening people. I've done over 410 of them now, and if this is new to you and you'd like to watch previous ones, go to batgap.com, B-A-T-G-A-P, and look under the past interviews menu where you'll find all the previous ones organized in several different ways. This show is made possible by the support of appreciative listeners and viewers. So if you appreciate it and feel like supporting it, there's a donate button on every page of the site, and there's also a page that explains other ways of donating if you don't like PayPal. My guest today is James Wood. James was a student of Richard Moss, who I interviewed a couple years ago. James works with groups and individuals to discover the fundamental reality of our essential nature. Having awakened in 2002, after years of study, he began to express a spontaneous teaching whose form continues to evolve. His message is that awakening is possible for anyone committed to finding truth. Originally, James studied philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin and transformational studies, again with Richard Moss. He has combined his education and experience to express a modern, integrated vehicle for others to use as a means of growth in consciousness, leading to awakening. He is dedicated to communicating the essence of the true teaching to those who are ready to receive it. And he has a book entitled The 10 Paths to Freedom, Awakening Made Simple, which we'll be discussing. So welcome, James.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
So I want to backtrack prior to your awakening in 2002 to see what your life was like and what may have led up to that. And I find that valuable, and I think listeners like it because it helps them relate to you as a person, because sometimes if you don't do that, then the person thinks, the person is more inclined to think, well, lucky him, but I don't think this could happen to me because of such and such. I'm too much of a schmuck or something. So we'll do that. But I want to start with your awakening in 2002 by simply asking, what do you mean by it, the awakening? I mean, when you say I awakened, it's one of those words that a lot of people define differently, I think. So what do you mean by it?
Well, first of all, it's really nice to be here. And I appreciate the work that you're doing with your website. I think it's helping a lot of people and will help a lot of people.
That's the intention.
Yeah. The way I define awakening is full conscious realization of reality.
Okay. Let's dig into that.
Let's do that.
Okay, so then prior to this awakening, you had partially conscious or partially unconscious realization of reality, or perhaps a predominance of unreality. Would that be fair to say?
Mostly unconscious, yes. Just ask Richard.
Were you a tough nut to crack?
Oh man, you have no idea.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be too self-deprecating, but yeah, it's pretty bad.
That's okay. I mean, we all came. A lot of us came from pretty dark places, and yeah. And I mean, and that's good to know. You don't have to be some kind of child prodigy to awaken. You can. I mean, I'm going to interview a woman next week, who who owned a biker bar and was a bartender for 25 years and was really strung out on cocaine and whatnot, and then had this profound shift and is doing very well now. So, and there are examples in ancient scriptures of people who are out and out scoundrels who ended up, undergoing a profound metamorphosis. So these are all possibilities,
Yeah, well, we're all scoundrels, I think. I mean, that's the thing about ego is, I almost want to say if you're infected with it, which is, it might sound kind of morbid, but, ego's the problem, if you will. That's what we're dealing with. And it makes us selfish and arrogant and a lot of other things. I was definitely those for sure. And I'm not going to say that I'm not that anymore. It's just that it's like when you wake up, you see the self, or one sees the self as I don't know, it's like a mirage or hallucination or something like that. And it's still there. It's just not like it doesn't tell you who you are anymore. So I feel like some terms are useful, and the word being, I feel, is who we are. It's our essence. It's nameless, formless. You could call it Atman or something like that if you wanted to. But the ego it's like an imposter that occupies our space, and it's collective as well. I mean, we can see it everywhere, and so I was definitely occupied by that, if you will, before.
Yeah. The word Maya actually comes from Sanskrit roots, which means that which is not.
Right.
And so it kind of remind me of that by saying that. So it's we take ourselves to be a certain thing, but we're actually not that.
Right. Yeah. And paradoxically, we are that.
Yeah.
That's what's interesting is, in Zen they say, first there's a mountain, then there's no mountain, then there's a mountain again. Mm-hmm. So first there's a self and a world that's opposed to it, and then you wake up and realize that's not true at all. It's freedom. And then, but then it's a mountain again, and then you see from that perspective of, no self, or from the awakened perspective, you see self and see that it's an illusion, like it's like I said, a mirage or something. And so you're not seeing the lake, you're seeing the mirage, which is a distortion, but everyone else is convinced it's a lake. Like everyone is convinced that the separate and separative self, if you will, the ego, is who they are. And it may sound like a judgment, like it's a bad thing. It's not. It just is. It's the condition of the world, and all you have to do is read the newspaper to kind of see evidence of that.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm thinking about what happened in Charlottesville. Frankly, I guess it was yesterday.
Yes. For those
I'm not sure what to say about that.
There was a white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, and then there were protesters opposing the white separatists, and they were having all these clashes and tear gas and all that stuff. And then some Nazi sympathizer drove a car into a crowd and killed a woman and injured a lot of people. So that's what you're referring to, in case people don't know.
Yeah, and I read, frankly, I find some of the news distasteful to read, and I think it's good to read some, but not too much. It's like there's a term called hormesis that's interesting. Someone asked me about this, like, what do I do? Someone drives a car into a crowd like that. And people get overwhelmed by that, like that's horrible, and what do I do? And I mean, I think a little bit of that, like awareness of what's going on, is important, but step away from the screen sometimes, go out in nature. It's like fasting. I do some intermittent fasting, which I think is wonderful.
I started doing that a few weeks ago myself, having done a lot in the 70s, but I decided to start doing it at least one day a week now. I've been enjoying it.
Yeah, it's great because, anyway, so you don't want to be on all the time. You don't want to be like reading the news all the time and like inundating yourself with negativity, which is basically what it is. But you want some, so you can be aware of what's going on, and then, take a retreat or something. And so like with food, you eat, you feast, and you fast, and it's part of life. So it's like form, no form. There's like this balance,
Yeah. I think that what you've been saying for the past 5 minutes points to an underlying theme which comes up on this show pretty often, and that is that, if I could explain it, that people tend to polarize. I mean, most of the world, as you said, is polarized in the direction of this is real, and I am this, and this is going to die, and all kinds of sort of limited conceptions of reality. And right. There are a bunch of spiritual people who kind of like swing to the other pole, and this is not real, it's not worth our attention, I don't exist in any way, shape, or form, there's no semblance of self and all that. And I don't know, I somehow think that you're alluding to a bigger package which puts everything in its proper context. Right. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree with that. After I woke up, that you could say there's a mountain and there's no mountain, right? And then there's a mountain again. Well, another way to look at it is it's like climbing a mountain. So let's say you start in the valley and you decide that you want to climb to the peak. Mm-hmm. So you set out and you have your path and you go up and you get to the peak and then you attain that, if you will. And then at least metaphysically or spiritually, when you attain that peak, you do realize that ego isn't real and the world isn't real and it's all an illusion. So those things are true for one who does that, who's in a sense attained that. So is there someone who attains it? No. I mean, that's, that's part of what that is. So, and I wouldn't say it's intoxicating, but it's brilliant and it's ultimately satisfying, and it's there's a freedom there it's really attractive. It's part of it is you look around at the world. I'll just speak for myself. So yeah, you wake up and you realize that the one that wakes up isn't you. It's truth that wakes up to itself through this vehicle, this person. And it's a wonderful place to hang out, and it's kind of tempting to do that. The thing is, what I've found is that it's not the most social place. It's in a way detached from ordinary living, which is where we meet people and live. So part of what I've been doing, frankly, the last few years, like the last few weeks, it's pretty much a daily thing, is coming back down the mountain and, what's the valley like? And, with wars and with like this violence that I was talking about in Charlottesville, things like that, it's unpleasant. It's nothing but drama. And yet that is, you mentioned Maya, it's actually one reality appearing as two.
Yeah.
So no one's going to say that. Someone might be watching this and say, well, that's dualistic or something to talk about. There's a car and then they get hit by a car. But really, there's a reality of suffering in the world that merits attention. And, so we embrace that. And it's not dualistic if the one who holds that awareness of non-duality, it's funny, if I'm really holding the awareness of non-duality, I can't talk, really. It's the words, there is a place where it doesn't matter. I don't matter, When I woke up, actually, and kind of strange perhaps, but when I woke up, it's such a place of freedom that I actually lost interest in food. Man, I didn't care. I mean, I care. But that place you see through everything. It's funny, I would say I saw through everything, but who am I? I mean, it is. And the body, the world, who cares, And it's actually, it's not even blissful. It's better than that. Franklin Merrill Wolff talked about it. And he called it the high indifference. And it's truly, it's impossible to talk about it. And he actually claims that this was later in his life, and he claimed that as much as he tried to describe the merits of it to people, that they were either perplexed or appalled, because, how could you be indifferent to suffering and, all of that? So if I'm going to embrace words and language, I'm hanging out with Rick and we're having a conversation like that. That's what I want to do. That's who I want to be. I'm James, you're Rick, there's suffering, and, let's do something about it. And I feel like what brings us to that place is compassion. So maybe you want to ask a question. I'm talking for a while.
That's okay. I tend to do that myself, but better that you should do most of it. I just want to refer people to an interview I did with a guy named Timothy Conway. I've done 2 with him, and he's a good friend. We've never met in person, but we resonate a lot with each other's perspective. But he wrote a really nice article, which I think I linked to from Batgap. You can find it on his site, enlightened-spirituality.org. But it's about the 3 simultaneously true levels of non-dual reality. And in this model, it's 3. Perhaps it could be chopped up in other ways. But what he outlines is there's the obvious level that everybody takes as real, in which there is starvation and disease and all, riots and all kinds of stuff that somehow need to be dealt with. And we don't just brush them off if somebody's suffering or something. We try to do something about it. And then there's, we could say, the divine level, which the level of God's intelligence, in which everything is perfect and divinely orchestrated, all's fine just as it is. And then you could say there's a more fundamental level at which it's just the transcendent. Nothing ever arose. There is no universe. There are no car crashes or anything else. It's just all the unmanifest. And his point is that living a life in which you can encompass all 3 of these simultaneously would be optimum. And yes, there will be a dimension of your life which is indifferent or aloof or untouched by all this, but then simultaneously there could be a dimension of your life in which you're, actively engaged in trying to solve some problem, or working with Doctors Without Borders, or doing stuff. And at the same time, there's this sort of trust in the divine that all is well and wisely put. So it's kind of a paradoxical, both and, all-inclusive kind of perspective that is not just philosophical, but could and should be experiential.
Right. Yeah, that is my experience. The Buddhists have, I don't know if it's the same thing as you're talking about, but they talk about there's the Dharmakaya, the Nirmanakaya, and the Sambhogakaya. So there's Dharmakaya is you could call it the absolute, but I'm sure Buddhists would disagree with that because it's not really anything. It's you could say it's emptiness or something like that, or at least you approach it through that doorway, and it's completely transcendent. Then you've got the Nirmanakaya, which is the form realm, which is, like you said, the suffering and car crashes and so on. But then there's a middle realm. The Sambhogakaya is the Bodhisattva realm. I think they call it a celestial body or something like that. I'm not a Buddhist in the strict sense. I just like a lot of the ideas. I'll use any ideas if they're useful. So.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's my experience, is a full embodiment of awakened consciousness includes all of that.
Yeah.
And when you say that, I'll paraphrase what you just said, where one must embody the Dharmakaya in order to, in a sense, meet the Nirmanakaya, which is really just suffering. It's what it is. First Noble Truth, right? And that's what it is. And so that third mountain position to me is that. And I say that, and there's a little bit of, I don't really believe that, because frankly, I'm not sure it ever ends. My experience of it deepens over time. And there's humility in that. So, I'm a guy, I'm a dude, I'm a man, I'm a person. And, it even sounds arrogant to say that. Well, of course that's true. It's just, I'm also that which is, and thou art that, we are that. So I think what humanity is doing, we're waking up and we're all part of it. So what am I going to do? Go to the mountaintop and die there? Blissful or not, I want to help.
Sure.
It's interesting. It sounds dualistic.
Even if you went to the mountaintop to die, I mean, literally speaking, as opposed to figuratively, the dying process would remind you rather severely that you do have a body, and it does feel pain and so on. So you can't ignore it, even if you want to ignore it.
Well, ego death is not physical death.
Right.
Or maybe it is. That's what's interesting about it. Like, what does the word physical mean? I did a lot of the work of Byron Katie. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Well, I knew you did from reading your articles. There's a lot of Katie-esque things in there.
Right. Yeah, I drilled down into that. I mean, I'm not bragging about it. It's literally the case. You can ask anyone that knew me back then. And, her question, is it true? Can you absolutely know it's true? No, you can't.
Right.
I exist. No, you can't know that. That's interesting. So it's like, yes, it's one appearing as two. And if I said to you, I'm drinking water, let's say we're hanging out, you and I say like, hey, Rick, could you pass me the glass of water? I'm thirsty. And you say, I'm sorry, that's dualistic and water doesn't exist. It's like, come on, dude. It's like, really?
Advaita speak. Advaita police.
Yeah, I mean, I'm being a bit harsh maybe, but I see a lot of it. And, anyone that's hearing this that might be rubbed the wrong way, good.
Yeah.
I mean that good. That's what is as well. And like, who is it that gets rubbed the wrong way? I mean, we could just go on all day on that.
No, I'm glad you're saying this stuff.
Yeah.
Here's a quote from one of your writings. It's important to realize that there are false teachings out there that will negate the existence of forms in a way that's dishonest. It's kind of what we're saying. And I've beaten this drum quite a bit over the years, too, on this show. And I think it's less than it used to be. I mean, there were allegedly a lot of people who came out of the Papaji scene who were talking that way, would you please pass the salt? Who wants the salt? There is no salt, and that kind of stuff. And I think everybody got kind of sick of that. Maybe there's a whole new crop of people rising up through the ranks that are at that stage. I don't know. But these days, it seems to me that the trend has been for a lot of people who have been around for a while to be emphasizing more integration and, a kind of a more holistic, well-balanced, complete realization rather than one in which you attempt to hide out in the transcendent. And I think part of the problem is people aren't even hiding out in the transcendent experientially. There's been a lot of cases where people have just read too much of this stuff and kind of gotten into the intellectual game of thinking that everything's not real, even though it's not their actual experience.
Right. Yeah. What's interesting, you're talking about hiding out in the transcendent. I know what you mean. And what's interesting is this is the transcendent.
Yeah.
Like, you handing me a glass of water is just as transcendent as anything. And that, to me, is a deeper realization, frankly. It's now, let's say, to use that metaphor, if you haven't reached the peak, I mean, that is a thing. We are talking about waking up. It is an actual event or non-event. I mean, it's not really an experience because there's not someone that has an experience that happens to that person that is gone. It's just truth wakes up to itself. That's probably as clearly as I can put it. And so that third mountain position of embracing the world compassionately is actually, it's what we're here for, I feel. And what I was going to say, though, is if you haven't realized that all is one perspective, and this sounds like a judgment, I think. Like, well, if you haven't realized it, then don't say it. It sounds, there's humility in that. I sent you some talks, some articles, and I did a talk one time where, I almost want to call him a heckler, but it was this guy, and I was talking about stuff, and he said, something like, if you say that you're awake, you can't be because there's not someone who's awake and it's impossible. And I just kind of let it go. But the fact is, if it's not true for you, then don't say it. I mean, there are a lot of prescriptions in Buddhism about not saying it. And the reason is, if it's not true for you, that's really a big pitfall on the path. And yes, there is a path, and no, there's not a path. So let's not get into that. Is there a doer? It's like, anyway. Yes, there is, and no, there isn't. They're both true.
There is no mountain, and there is.
Right, or neither is true, But
Donovan wrote a great song about that. You ever hear that Donovan song?
Sure.
Yeah.
First there was a mountain, yeah.
Right.
So basically, what I'm saying is, if it's true for you, if it's not true, then don't say it. If it is true, then you really must say it. I mean, the Buddha himself said it. Jesus said, "I am." What did he say? "I am the way."
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's important. And it's, part of the reason I decided to do this show is I live here in Fairfield, Iowa, where, thousands of people have been meditating for decades. And many of them were starting to have awakenings, genuine things. And some of them would find that when they told their friends, the friends would put them down and say, oh, who do you think you are? I mean, you don't float 3 feet off the ground, and you're just Joe Schmo. I know you have a problem with your business or whatever. They didn't think they didn't associate real human stuff with actual awakening, and so I thought, all right, let me start interviewing some of these people and just demonstrate to the local population that there are people among us who are having awakenings, so that it will perhaps enable more people to come out of the closet and instill some confidence or hope in the people who don't think it's ever going to happen to them. And then the whole thing kind of grew and reached an international audience. But that was one of the original motivations.
Yeah, I think what I like to see, I think the word awakening to me, I mean, this is just semantic really, but awakening isn't it, maybe with a capital A, I don't know, but it's like there is an event where you could call it end of suffering or ego death or something like that. Okay, that's a thing. But on the way there's what I would call growth in consciousness. Right. That's just the term I use. Mm-hmm. And so it's important to acknowledge if you're growing in consciousness, and yet the ego is so insidious that it'll try to co-opt your progress and make it like you're wearing a badge and whatever. It is insidious, and frankly, I emphasize working with a teacher, and I use the term true teacher just to make sure that we're clear about what that is. Working with Richard, for example, for me was, I'd say priceless. It's more than that. That he was able to see that, they're not hidden really. I mean, they were hidden to me, right? It was unconscious, but not to anyone else, It's like, get a load of this guy. But he saw that, and he mirrored that to me. And I can't say it was always pleasant, but I'm really grateful for that. Mm. It's like I almost want to say it was like a WWE SmackDown for the ego, It's just, yeah. Nothing. I almost want to say Jon Snow. Sorry, I'm thinking Game of Thrones. Seriously, though, that's an in-joke for Game of Thrones fans out there.
Okay.
Yeah, so the thing is, he was just reflecting something for me, and it's hard to take that. The term humble pie, I'm not sure where that comes from, but, you have to eat some humble pie until there's actual, humility there, and then there's a certain transparency, there's not as much ego, and you can recognize that, but just don't stop until you're done.
Yeah.
And the question, I'll say this real quick, the question may come up, like, how do you know you're done? That's a good question, I think.
Stick a fork in your leg. See if,
Yeah, right. You ascend, is it 3 meters or 3 point, let's see. I think it's 3.14, but, there's no end to pi. No, I'm kidding. Yeah. Seriously, though, so how do you know if awakening, how do you know if you've truly arrived, so to speak? The question doesn't arise. And that is my experience. It sees itself, and then the self, truth sees that. And the self, there's like a sense of self, but it's just kind of hanging around. It doesn't control anything. It never did. It's just now it's like, it's over, buddy. You're done. And, and it's like thoughts arise, and you're like, this is... this is BS. This is not, whatever the stream of thoughts are, it doesn't tell you who you are anymore. And then, it's just this freedom.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. But, so that's a good question. So, if the thought still arises, well, gee, am I there yet? And you think, well, maybe I'll change my name to, Swami something or another. And, I would advise against that, because that is a pitfall. It is.
Yeah.
And that's for not for me. I don't care. That's just for anyone who might be hearing this. So just keep going, and when it happens, it's good. You'll know. It's not a thought that arises. It's not like a thought tells you like you've arrived. That's just another thought. It's a realization. It's something like that.
Yeah, I have several thoughts and questions based on what you've just said. One is about the point of having a teacher who can kind of see through your ego and help you diminish or dismantle it. Some teachers have notoriously taken on that role and done so in an extremely uncompassionate or even brutal manner. And the upshot of it was that they themselves were not free of ego, but they just thought they were. So you get guys like Andrew Cohen, and who eventually was kicked out of his organization and did a real mea culpa and has been really working to shift gears. Or Adi Da, who did outrageous things like, I don't even want to get into it, it's so disgusting. But I think one should exercise discrimination as far as who one accepts as a teacher. And if a teacher is abusive and in the name of ego busting, really being mean to people, look somewhere else. Be careful.
I agree.
So there's that thought.
Richard isn't
comment
mean.
on that before? No, Richard's very sweet. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
He is, obviously. I mean, we know him. No, he's that ego smackdown thing I was talking about. It's unpleasant, but it's not cruel.
Right.
It's compassionate, and yet it feels. I never felt that it was cruel. That some people might interpret it that way and think. I guess what brings me back is like, is it true? Mm-hmm. Maybe that's Katie again, but it's like, James, you're kind of. This is something Richard used to say. Is James, you're kind of rigid. You're kind of, you need to loosen up a little bit. That was sort of a reflection that I got from him and other students, and it bothered me. And first of all, it bothered me, which is telltale. The other thing is when I really looked at it. I had to care enough to look at it. I had to respect the teaching enough to look at self, look at ego as best I could, and be like, there's something to that. And that's hard to do, but I think, I think that's what one must do. It's you have to see yourself as you are, without flinching and without judgment. And what's interesting is, I like to say that the mind is really just a stream of judgments. None of them are true. So any thought I have is not ultimately true. And, I use this mudra sometimes. It's like, we'll contract, like, oh, I'm this, I'm that, right? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. It's like, it's not so much like someone says I'm rigid, like when I was a student. It's like, I'm not rigid, but the self is rigid. And you start to get a little, it loosens a little bit. You're like, oh man, what is this imposter, this parasite that's latched onto my being? This name and form, entity or set of ideas about who I am that isn't true. And the things you have to see it first. Yeah. And then like, oh, it's interesting. It's like, yes, self is rigid. And then at some level, it's like, it isn't who I am. So I don't know if that makes any sense.
Well, are you distinguishing between true self and personality? Like you had some rigid tendencies in your personality, but that's not who you are?
I was really hardcore. I mean, as a student, I'm sure there are people out there that could outdo me in that regard, but I was really focused and determined and
kind of fanatical.
And well, I wasn't fanatical. Like I wasn't pushing for an ideology or for a view. It was just I've tried really hard, and some of that is ego. Yeah. Like I'm going to do this, and we could talk about like a deliberate path versus spontaneous awakening, which I think is interesting. You and Richard discussed that. I saw the interview, but I mean, I was deliberate. I was like, this is what I want. I want to wake up. I want to be free, and yet there's a lot of rigidity there, but that can be used, that you loosen that up a little bit. Like, I was in this Richard's program. It's called the Mentor Program. It's a 3-year residential process. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't go in all year. You go twice a year. It's wonderful. Anyway, right. When I showed up at the Mentor Program, the first meeting, I was, and again, yes, I'm saying I was, okay, it's like ego, self was, whatever. I was like so gung-ho that it actually irritated the other participants. Mm-hmm. And that was interesting. but a part of it, what I realized was, like, I had my regular life where I go out with my friends and maybe party and just go out and have a few beers and just relax and not talk about, quote unquote spiritual matters. And then I'd go to these meetings and just be, so focused and almost monk-like, just like a laser. And by the end of it, I realized, like, well, I was actually our last meeting, I'd heard this enough and I relaxed enough. Richard helped me with that enough that, I went out with one of my friends from the group, and as I recall, I had 4 pints of Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, and no, I'm not a sponsor, but no, 4 pints. What is 4 pints? Is that half a gallon? I can't really think, but usually I was like, man, I wouldn't be doing that. Like, it's a spiritual retreat, right? We work all day, go out, and like, yeah, let's go out and have some beers. So we went out, pleasantly altered, if you will, and usually like the next day I'd be hungover. I'd be like, oh man, why did I do that? Right? Guilt, shame, all that kind of stuff. I felt great. And I feel like there was a deeper realization there of, frankly, humanness. Just, go out and have a beer, dude. It's fine. Like, who you are, you don't have a spiritual self and then a partying self. I mean, it's one thing, and it is a party, and just, everyone's invited. So just be yourself, but, integrate that. It's more authentic.
Do you still like to drink sometimes?
Definitely. I didn't drink. Actually, it's interesting. Around the time that I woke up, I had a commitment to be sober, and it's interesting. It's quite a story, but don't want to bore anyone with it. But I was sober for about 6 years, including the time that I woke up. And at some point, I realized that alcohol would be helpful in, frankly, just grounding. And, like I said, I was sort of more in that mountaintop space for a while. And I'm like, I like to drink sometimes. And, the craft brewing scene's amazing. I mean, it's, I don't pound Budweiser like I might have in high school. Exactly. But, I'll sip a nice IPA or something, and it's wonderful. It's got this aromatic nose, and you can taste it. It's wonderful.
Yeah, the reason I asked is that, when I learned to meditate, I soon found that the way I felt all the time couldn't be improved upon by any chemical substance, alcohol or marijuana or anything. It's like I felt worse if I tried something like that, and so I just completely lost interest in it and never thought about it again. But anyway, I guess to each his own, and things are different for different people.
Yeah, actually, I will tell you this. Currently, it's in the moment. It's like, how am I, if I drink this substance, what is it doing to me now?
Yeah.
Next week it might be different. So, again, that's rigidity, right? It's dogma, like, I'm not going to drink because it's bad. It's like, well, maybe sometimes it's not. What I've noticed is, it's a CNS depressant, right? Alcohol is.
Central nervous system, yeah.
Sure, and I noticed that even now, like, I can enjoy it, but lately it seems like I've really noticed that it's like a damper a little bit. Like, I'll feel a higher energy or more present. And I've told you I was doing some intermittent fasting. Like, I find that with the fasting, it's really wonderful. There's sort of clarity and an energy that feels really good. And then I've noticed that, if I drink, it puts a damper on that. And I think you can sort of play with that, that's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
But it may be useful. Like I said, when I woke up, I was completely, I would say stone cold sober, whatever that is. But yeah, I was sober.
Yeah.
So, I think, if you listen within yourself and you're like, yes, this serves me right now, then yeah.
Okay.
Whatever it is.
Let's go back to the whole waking up thing. I received an email.
No, let's talk about drinking. I want to talk about.
You want to keep doing that?
I'm kidding.
I received an email from somebody a couple weeks ago who said, you can clarify your confusion about this waking up thing if you think of it as like water boiling. There's, a certain phase transition point at which water boils, 100 degrees centigrade, 212 Fahrenheit, and before that it's not boiling, after that it's boiling. turns to steam. And he said it's like that with awakening. There may be many, many degrees of growth of consciousness, as you put it earlier, but there is definitely a specific point at which awakening happens. It's clear, it's unmistakable, it's a clear demarcation. Now others say, Christ said in the Bible that the kingdom of heaven sneaks up like a thief in the night. And I've heard Adyashanti and some others say that, you can sort of slip into awakening and not really even know that it's happened or know, mark it on a calendar or anything like that, because it grows so incrementally. So would you disagree with that, and say that for everyone there's definitely going to be a point at which there's a shift that is unmistakable, or what?
Well, you said some really interesting things. What did you, thief in the night, was that
Yeah,
it?
Jesus said, I think that's what he might have meant by that allegory, that
Sure.
the kingdom of heaven sneaks up like a thief in the night.
Yeah, it does. It's interesting because the mind can't grasp it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it does. It's interesting. The night before I woke up, I remember I had a sort of a foreboding, a sense of presence, or I could say light or energy, but that it's like I would say it's awareness or consciousness, something like that. It is like a light. It's just not literally a being of a light or something. And I have to say, when after it happened, it was clear that something had happened, and that my partner at the time asked me what had happened. She could feel it. It was interesting. It actually happened while I was sleeping. Mm-hmm. I went to sleep. I know I totally fell asleep and then woke up. So it's not unprecedented, I guess.
Right.
But so I really felt like something was going on the night before, and I wasn't. He was suffering tremendously before that experience. I wasn't. I was on a deliberate path. So I've been doing a lot of practices and felt again a sense of foreshadowing, whatever. And then so when I woke up literally out of sleep, everything was different. It was like it woke up. It looks around, and the self's kind of hanging around, but like it gets up, goes in the bathroom, looks in the mirror. I'm looking, and yet who am I? It's like Ramana Maharshi read, like there aren't any words for that. And it's looking at itself, and so did I know what that was? No. I mean, did I know, like, oh, I just woke up? No. I mean, but what happened was I left the bathroom just kind of astounded, just really open and just not knowing. Came back, went back in the room, and she had gotten up too. I mean, I could tell, I could feel her there. She was like, something had just happened, I could feel that sort of sense. And she said, I think she said, what happened? Like, what happened? What just happened? Something like that. And I said, okay, so the thought came up. This is like the old man. I knew William Samuel, by the way. I don't know if you knew that, but he used to say, man whose breath is in his nostrils. So the old man, the mortal man or whatever, the thinking part. She said, what happened? And I could hear the thought like, well, I woke up and I went in the bathroom and I looked in the mirror and it was really weird. And oh my gosh, what is that? But it was different thoughts, right? But what's interesting is so I was going to say I woke up and did all this stuff. And what I said was, I woke up. Mm-hmm. I mean, who said that? Who is that? I would say I don't know. And yet it's the not knowing that's grounded in beingness that just, it's apparent, and yet it isn't an object of thought. So did I know what that was? Heck no. And yet it is evident. So to answer your question, I would say they're kind of both true. I saw Adya one time. I saw him in Tucson. I don't know, it was within a year or two after I woke up, and I was curious about it to see what he was like, because I hadn't met him before. And I was listening to him, and I heard that, I heard him basically acknowledge that it's an event. It is a transition. But the idea that you're going to somehow know in terms of like conceptual cognition that you've arrived, that's not it at all.
And how would one distinguish between? And sometimes people can have some real explosive or profound or dramatic spiritual experiences or shifts. And how would one know that that's it, or that that wasn't just something? I mean, even referencing Adya, he's spoken about, you know, how easy it is for a person to sort of have a realization and figure that's the final thing, where it's actually not. And one can hang out in that place for quite a while before realizing that perhaps that wasn't final.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Like I said, the thought doesn't arise. That's the clearest way I could put it. Like, it's just not true.
What thought doesn't arise?
The thought, well, am I there? Am I there? You know, I mean, it's funny because I just had, you know, that's a thought, right? But it's
so there's
just
a confidence, a natural confidence.
It's like, is the Earth flat? Rick, is the Earth flat, Rick? It's like, it's like, no, it just reality is, it is funny. I mean, it's interesting. Like, reality is, and, you know, there's all these thoughts and they're not true. And yet they can be relatively true. That's what's interesting, is there is a relative truth. Like, could you pass me the salt? That's a relative truth. Mm-hmm. And to deny that is ridiculous. Like we talked about, like we're in a restaurant, you know, hand me the water, you know, of course it exists in some sense. I lose my train of thoughts sometimes.
Okay, I'll jump in here then.
Yeah.
So among your fellow students with Richard, or among your own students, have there been awakenings akin to what you experienced?
I don't know.
Don't people talk about them?
I'm not really. Well, I'm in touch with a few. I'm in touch with a few of. Really, there's probably just one friend that I had in the group that I'm kind of in touch with, like on Facebook. Mm-hmm. I haven't sought them out.
Okay.
And that's, I would like to. I probably will at some point. And I'll ask them. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess the reason I asked that question is, you know, whether there was a similarity in their orientation to what happened because of the path they were on, or the tradition they were in, you know?
Yeah, okay, yeah, you were talking about like big experiences, like a lot of energy and like Kundalini explosions and things. Now, I listened to Richard's interview, and I know him well, and I've read about it, and read The Black Butterfly, and my sense of what he went through, and I'm willing to be wrong about this, but my sense is that, and you guys talked about this, it was interesting, his path was not what you might call a deliberate path. I mean, it was, but he admits that he wasn't quite sure what it was he was doing at the time. He was experimenting with energy and healing, and you know, he met Franklin Merrill Wolff. Mm-hmm. As I recall, in The Black Butterfly. I mean, that's something. So you meet Franklin Merrill Wolff.
Maybe you should say who he was. Most people won't know who he was.
Sure, he was. If I have a lineage, I would say Richard's my teacher, and Franklin Merrill Wolff was his teacher. Mm-hmm. And I would say that Franklin Merrill Wolff's teacher was Shankara, because if you read his book Experience in Philosophy, he really penetrated those texts and entered a deep meditation. That's why the second chapter of my book is called Study, because sometimes I think people think that just reading is not very useful for spiritual progress. Mm-hmm. But it really is if you bring a certain focus to it. And I feel that that's largely what he was doing. So yeah, so Shankara, Franklin Merrill Wolff, Richard. He was, we could talk all day about Franklin, but he was a brilliant mathematician. I think he was at Harvard. And he studied mathematics to the point where he realized that realm of study in the university, like he was on a tenure track, he could have just written his own ticket. But he intuitively recognized that it was limited. And he wanted to know truth. He wanted to realize truth itself. So he left and he moved to the base of Mount Whitney, because someone had said, some sage had said that the place with the greatest spiritual power is the tallest peak in that country. So at the time, before Alaska was added, you know, it was Mount Whitney, California. So he lived at the base of Mount Whitney, and that's where he woke up and did his work. And it's still there. The center is still there. I haven't been there yet, but yeah.
Okay.
He's highly philosophical. He's it may not be everyone's cup of tea in that form, you know, that it's very rational, but it's extremely precise, and I found it highly useful.
Mm. Yeah. So speaking of your book, let's go through the main chapter titles of your book, and
oh, could I say one thing real quick?
Yeah.
I don't really think very linearly, so I'm coming back to something.
Mm-hmm.
So the big energy experiences, like you said, I think, see, I was prepared. So Richard went through that. He was prepared, but like he says in his interview, he wasn't led through it. He wasn't spoon-fed or handheld really with a teacher through a process. I was. And I'm grateful to him because I think it was because of the difficulties that he had after his opening. I mean, he talks about that, how destabilizing it was. That it's thanks to him that, frankly, when I woke up, it was actually quite easy. I mean, there's a lot of energy. There were some things that happened that were kind of mind-blowing, if you will, just a lot of energy and, you know, kind of a destabilization. But I felt, in a sense, I felt him there. I felt a presence that had led me all along. And in a sense, it ushered me across that threshold with great kindness. And so it doesn't have to be difficult. But so I think if it's a more spontaneous thing, I think it can be a lot more dramatic and destabilizing because the mind hasn't quite been prepared for that yet.
Nor the physiology. I mean,
right.
It takes a certain physiological purity and strength to sustain or maintain, to embody awakening and the energies that come with that. And if people haven't done any sort of work in that area, you're pouring new wine into an old wineskin, to use another biblical metaphor, and it can
do it.
Very problematic.
You can do it. Mm-hmm. Sorry to talk over you there.
That's all right.
Yeah, it is problematic. Like, it's kind of like having an old car whose frame is bent, and maybe you straighten it, so you do some work, you know, get straight psychologically, but maybe it's not totally straight yet, and then take it out on the freeway, you know.
Yeah.
Take it up to 100, see what happens. You know, it might rattle. You know, can you get there? So the early stages of work, I usually there's like a level 2. It's in the book. It's just a way of looking at it, but you get straightened out earlier on so that, you know, when you enter like when I did the mentor program with Richard, I'd been prepared a bit. So it's like acceleration. There's a lot more energy. Change happens really fast, and it is destabilizing. But if you get that, so like, yeah, if you get your vehicle and you really straighten it out and tune it up, it might be off slightly, but you can really, you know, you could go 100 on the freeway and it'll be a relatively smooth journey.
Yeah. Somebody once asked Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, "Can't you just enlighten us like that?" You know, and he said, maybe I could, but it would take 10 strong men to hold you down.
All right. Would that I could, right? I mean, just
yeah.
Sure, not, but yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe we're here to enjoy the journey, and I've written about that I started to enjoy it closer to the end of the path. The earlier parts are pretty difficult and kind of humiliating, you know, to the ego. But you know, later on, it was enjoyable. Like I said, I was doing the work of Byron Katie, and I noticed that when I would do some of that work, I would feel better.
Sure.
I would feel happier, but not just happy, but like there was a joy. And it was wonderful. And I was like, wow, I'm just going to keep doing that, you know, just keep going. And that's what happened.
I think it should be enjoyable in the long run. I mean, there might be a dark night of the soul thing where you no longer derive enjoyment from the things you used to, and yet you haven't found adequate inner enjoyment to sort of really, you know, fulfill you. And so there's a dry period. But ultimately, I think the whole spiritual path, and feel free to differ, but the whole spiritual path is largely about greater happiness.
Sure.
You know.
But can you really be happy if you're not free?
Yeah.
See, that's what's interesting. People want to be happy. I've been thinking about this. Everyone wants to be happy. I mean, I think if you actually Googled this the other day, it's kind of silly, but I'm like, what do people want more than anything else? And just to see what would come up. And some people, you know, the freedom is there, but happiness is really what people want. Well, I want to be rich. I want to be successful. I want to be loved and all this. And it's basically because people want to be happy, right?
Yeah.
But you know what? It's not enough, because if you're not free, you can't really be happy, because in a sense you're a slave. And that sounds harsh perhaps, but Kant talked about that, right? So it's the second noble truth. If there's desire, it's like you're being driven by unconscious forces. It's like an addiction, you know. And if you're driven by an addiction, it's miserable. And at some point, so ego is like an addiction. It's an addictive or compulsive attachment to self. Like that's self is who I am, and you can't not do it. That's what compulsive means. It's like an addict cannot not do it. But with help, you become free of that. And if you're truly free of all that, free of ego, then yeah, why not be happy? So I feel like, it is the way to happiness. It's just interesting because, like, wouldn't you choose to be happy? And can you choose to be happy if you're not free? It's just something to think about, something that came to me.
And what you're saying kind of begs the question, well, where does happiness come from? What is the essential ingredient of happiness? Does it come from what we experience through our senses? If so, it's very tentative and variable and unstable, because what we experience through our senses is always going to change. And if it's not what we experience through our senses, how come we seem to get happier when we experience a nice thing and less happy when we experience a bad thing? But then, can there be found a source of happiness which is independent of what we experience through our senses? Kind of a deeper wellspring of happiness. And of course,
I think so.
Yeah, spiritual traditions have all talked about this.
Sure. I mean, well, happiness includes sadness, There's up and down, high and low. I mean, it's the human scene. I mean, one could say, well, what about the bliss of nirvana? Well, I'm not talking about that. That's different. But just happiness.
I'm kind of talking about that.
Oh, okay.
I mean,
let's talk about that then.
In terms of ultimately what is really going to fulfill the human craving for happiness, I don't know if anything else ultimately will.
I agree with that. What's funny about it, though, is you have to let go of happiness in order to have it.
Yeah.
You have to let go. I mean, there's nirvanic bliss, and then there's, it's like there's nirvana and samsara, and they're the same.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds, that's, Franklin Murray Wolf, if you read, so his book is Experience in Philosophy, if you look at his, part of that book is called Philosophy on Consciousness Without an Object. It's really worth reading. And, he talks about that. He says, his summation is something like, besides the great space, there is no other. But before that, he talks about how, there's nirvana and there's samsara, and yet from the perspective of that, again, transcendent consciousness, they're the same. That's why the third mountain position can't be dualistic if you're awake, because, you're eating a hamburger, and yet is there someone, it's both true and not true at the same time. I'm not sure if I'm addressing your point. I just think there's so you're talking about bliss. I think that's tempting, to think bliss is the point. I mean, bliss is okay, but I have to say, when I woke up, it was, it's peaceful. I mean, do you want to be blissed out all the time, or do you want to be at peace, like that, just free?
Yeah.
Bliss is great. It's just, I like bliss too.
I think what I'm saying is that not that, I mean, blissed out implies a sort of like a slightly overwhelming kind of situation. I think there's a sort of a baseline of contentment. It's called santosh in Sanskrit, which characterizes the awakened state, and which is independent of changing experiences and circumstances, and which there's a saying, how was it? Contact with Brahman is infinite joy, and it's kind of this juxtaposition of the awakened consciousness with relative experience that stirs up waves of bliss, the way sloshing around in a bathtub stirs up the warmth. If you've been lying too still, you don't feel the warmth anymore. Slosh around a bit, you begin to stir it. So I'm just kind of saying this stuff because people talk about, being enlightened and yet being depressed or neurotic or this and that, and I wonder whether such people have really worked it out, and that perhaps the more traditional, the Zen monk, with his hands in the air, laughing with a big pot belly, is actually more characteristic of what true enlightenment or full enlightenment really is.
Yeah, chop wood, carry water.
Yeah.
Totally. It's just like I said. It's there's that realization of freedom, and then or nirvana, if you want to call it that, and then yeah, and then sure, chop wood, carry water. I mean, that's yeah. I mean, I do feel part of it is I don't control it.
Yeah.
I say I, and it really does come back to who am I. Um, I would say I don't know, and there's wisdom in that. It's what I am is unknowable, and yet its relationship with form, yeah, it's pleasurable. It can be unpleasant, it could be blissful in a sense, but to me that's yeah, it does stir up a certain kind of enjoyable sensation maybe.
Well, let's say in your darker
yeah,
moments, even now,
yeah,
if something happens in your life, or I don't know, you're sick, or something happens, do you still discern a dimension in your life which is untouched by those things and which sustains you in a way, which
yes,
40 years ago, 30 years ago, if you had been under similar circumstances and bereft of that dimension, you would have felt the full impact of the negative thing with no buffer, with no sort of foundation, that to modify or to put the relative experience in a larger context.
right. I mean, I agree with what you just said. That's
Yeah.
basically how it is. Like, yeah, I get sick sometimes, and it's really unpleasant. It can be overwhelmingly painful, depending on what it is.
Sure.
And in those moments, the pain or the unpleasantness certainly dominates the field of awareness. And yet there is that sense of detachment
Yeah,
that's
it's not the
there.
entirety of who and what
Right.
of your experience. Yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't judge. It's funny because the self, like ego wants to judge, but it when you're awake, it's like, again, I don't know if you can see my hand, but
I can.
so judgment's like,
Gripping.
I want this or I don't want that. It's desire and aversion and attachment.
Mm-hmm.
So an unpleasant experience comes up. We usually we pull away from it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want that. So it's over there, and we're trying to, and it's based in a judgment. I find that doesn't arise. So, and yes, it does add to the misery if you're judging it. When the judgment doesn't arise, it's almost like a flower. So the mind still runs. As the heart pumps blood, the mind pumps thoughts. So it's arising, and it's as if awareness sees it. It's like, yeah, it's not true.
Yeah.
And yet, when it's really painful, the body's cringing, the nervous system is like, it could be. And yet, there's no judgment of that. So it's allowing a human experience. And yeah, it's wonderful. I'm not going to say that I don't feel pain. That would be silly.
Sure. But
who feels pain?
Right.
That's what's interesting. I heard that you know a lot about Ramana Maharshi, I believe, hearing you speak.
I'm not an expert.
I know a bit. I mean, historically, my understanding is that he had cancer at the end of his life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, of course, who had cancer, and that I don't think he sought medical attention for that, did he? Is that, did I read that correctly?
He let people do all kinds of things to him, whatever they wanted to do, and he wasn't seeking it, but all concerned people were all tending to him and trying different things.
Sure,
but he didn't get morphine or anything to muffle his pain.
Yeah, it seems like I read somewhere that his quote was, "Let it grow."
Yeah.
Which, like, really? But from that oceanic consciousness, it's nothing.
Yeah.
Let me give
you an example.
Did he experience pain? He might, like Sri Ramana. To whom does that thought arise? To whom does the sensation arise? Yeah, I get that.
Yeah. I think here's an example that'll wrap up this point, and that is that,
sure.
Let's say you had $10 to your name, and you lost $5, or you gained $5. Somebody gave you $5. That'd be a big deal. That'd be like significant change in your financial status. But let's say you had just won the lottery. Somebody just won the lottery the other night, got $300-something million, and then somebody gives you $5, or you lose $5. It's like, what does it matter? In the context of my financial status, it's not that significant. I think that we can use that as a metaphor for, kind of an awakened consciousness and its orientation to the gains and losses in life relative to an unawakened consciousness, which doesn't really have the capacity to sustain major gains and losses without being shaken.
I think that's a good analogy. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So
about my book, you were going to ask me about the book.
I was.
So
I mean, you have a bunch of chapters, and each one of these words that constitutes a chapter title is an interesting area for discussion.
And by the way, I'm interrupting you just to say there was some discussion prior to this about maybe I would send you a copy or something. The reason I didn't is it's 100,000 words. It's 300 pages, and I just, I figured. I don't know. I figured to read that entire thing and assimilate it in a week.
Well, I wouldn't have. You would have had to say read, pages right. 35 through 38 and 45 to, like that.
Sure.
I wouldn't have read all of it. But that's okay. But the chapter titles are nice. Now, I'll read them quickly, all 10 of them, and then we can maybe poke around through them. So, honesty, study, instruction, action, commitment, embodiment, meditation, community, life, devotion. And this is called the 10 Paths to Freedom. So are you presenting these as autonomous, independent paths or stages in an overall system, or what are you saying here with these words?
Yeah, each one could be used in itself, and if you read the introduction, which I recommend, it explains that. Mm-hmm. Of course, you didn't have a copy, so. but I mean, for anyone who's watching this, it's definitely worth reading, and I would read the introduction, and it's like I said, there's a way of reading that's more in depth and more focused. It's not just the thoughts or the words. It's like there's a depth. So, So it's interesting because what I would say is it's a linear. When I wrote it, I started writing this a couple of years after I woke up, and like I said, I was really in that more mountaintop perspective. And the main thing that book is about is how did I get there, so to speak. Right, there is no one and no one gets anywhere. We all agree on that. But basically, that's how I got there. And it is a linear, I think it's important to read it in a linear fashion. If you just jump in the middle, it might not make sense because I defined terms early on. But if you read the whole thing, you're like, okay, and you kind of take that in. And once you grok that whole thing, then you could read, you could use one chapter of the other, like chapter 7's meditation. Yes, you can use that by itself. And yet what's interesting is, like, frankly, every chapter could be looked at as a form of meditation. So it's really nonlinear, and yet if you read it, I would recommend starting at the beginning and going all the way through.
Well, let's discuss some of these just for fun and see what come out of it. So honesty, for instance. Would you say that honesty is an important starting point for a person, and if they're going to embark on the spiritual path, or if they're already embarked and maybe haven't really taken care of that area of their life they should? Yeah.
That was really important for me. I read a book called Radical Honesty by Brad Blanton. I don't agree with everything he says in it, but one of my mentor friends, a student, had gone to one of his seminars and he told me about it. And I was like, wow, I got to check this guy out, because if you look at him, how Blanton lives, I haven't looked at it lately, but he's just brutally honest, and I don't always agree with that you're almost to the point of cruelty, But basically, I read the book and I realized I just could sense that was important for me. This is when I was a student. So I embraced it. I'm like, I'm going to do that, right? I'm going to be honest. And I think even the same day or the next day, something happened where I realized that I would have lied about it before. It was subtle, and I was like, oh man, I can't do that. But I'd committed to it, so I told the truth about it. What had happened is a good friend of mine came by. My apartment was a mess. I mean, it was like a train wreck. I felt bad about it. And he came by and knocked on the door. I realized, I'm like, oh man, I can't let him in. This place is terrible. And I love this guy, he's a good friend. And so he knocked and then went away. My car was in the driveway, so...
He knew you were there.
Yeah, or maybe I went for a walk or something. So he called me later, and I'm like, oh man, I got to tell him. I knew, I'd read that book, I'd committed, and I'm like, oh man, I got to tell him the truth. I'm like, all right, I'll do it. And it's hard to do.
Yeah.
It's embarrassing. See, that's part of that, the ego's got to be seen. and it's unpleasant. So he he said, hey, I dropped by earlier and your car was there. I knocked on the door and didn't answer. What's going on? Immediately, like, I knew that what I would have said before, it's terrible, I know, but what I would have said was, oh yeah, I was in the shower, or something. Don't we all do that? Or I've all done it probably. And I said, you know what? His name is John. I said, John, I was there and I heard you knocking and I was just embarrassed. My place is a mess and I didn't want to let you in. And he said, oh man, that's okay, and I understand that. And gosh, it was a relief. It was like, wow, I don't have to hide anymore. And also, I'm like, I really want my friend to come visit, so I had to clean the place up. And if I hadn't embraced that, I don't think I would have done it. There are other examples, but yeah, it was liberating quite a bit. And people won't like it. I mean, I remember I was single quite a bit at that time, and I would go out on dates sometimes, and I would meet someone and like, yeah, I'm into this thing called radical honesty. It's amazing. And I talk a little bit. I'd never see him again,
Yeah.
Looking at the watch like, I don't know. It's just, but eventually you meet someone that says, really, that's awesome. And, that's the person you want to be with. So.
That's great.
Yeah.
And there's a saying in Sanskrit, that says, it comes down to something like, speak the truth, which is sweet. And,
right.
Obviously there was a story of Winston Churchill running into some woman at a party, and he walked up to the woman and he said, Madam, you're the ugliest person I've ever met. And she said, Mr. Churchill, you're drunk. And he said, yes, but in the morning I'll be sober, yet you'll still be the ugliest person I've ever met.
Oh my gosh.
And so, maybe that, and obviously that was his subjective opinion, so it's not necessarily even truth. But I think people can get kind of in your face in the name of honesty sometimes. And
yeah, the teacher, I mean, my experience with Richard, frankly, he basically, I mean, I'm speaking just about him. I would think that any authentic teacher would probably be like this, but like, basically ego gets reflected back. How does that work? I'm not sure, but it does. And every time I talked to him, when I first started working with him, it changed over time. I had to grow past that, right? But I mean, I couldn't live like that. I had to do it. But yeah, when I first started working with him, it's like everything I said sounded like idiocy, and it was. I mean, on some level, it was just blah blah, me, and I'm like, I didn't really notice it unless I was speaking to him, and he would just look at me. I mean, that's not cruel. That's honest. It was like, it's like a space where you hear yourself, like a canyon where it reflects back, and you're like, oh my God, is that what I sound like? And it's wonderful. I mean, if you use it, or if ego wins that particular battle, you could blame the teacher, which I don't recommend, because that's, it doesn't get you anywhere.
Well, let's take another example. Let's say you're married or you're in a committed relationship. I don't know what the legal status is here, but let's say you find yourself, befriending someone else, and there was a friendship growing. Would you just tell your partner, hey, this friendship is growing, or would you think, all right, I'm just going to deal with this somehow and not necessarily put this in her face, and kind of somehow come to terms with this situation, rather than really rock the boat?
Well, you can rock it a little bit. Right.
It's
the middle way, right? You don't want to rock it too much. Yeah, you want to be honest. I mean, I wouldn't, like, you haven't met Allie, but my partner Allie and I, I would tell her something like that. Mm-hmm. I mean, to me, and this is sort of in the book I lay it out quite systematically, but what I call basic honesty is telling the truth, mm-hmm. and it means not misrepresenting your experience. So, I see what looks like an orange globe on your bookcase there.
Yeah, like
I would say
there's things.
Yeah, there's an orange globe on your bookcase. Mm-hmm. That matches my experience. We probably both agree on that. Mm-hmm. So that's basically honest.
But human relationships are more complicated and messy.
Well, yeah, there's another level. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Nuanced, I said, yeah.
Yeah, right. The next level, if you will, is not just telling the truth, but when do you tell it? To whom do you tell it? Why? who's around that might hear it. There's all these things, and you have to listen a little more.
Yeah.
You have to be like, okay, is it appropriate?
What's the
Maybe
greatest
it's some
good?
privacy. Yeah. So I call it situational honesty, which sounds like it doesn't mean that you change the truth to fit the situation. It means that you just notice what your situation is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you think that dishonesty, and it's not a black and white situation as you just said, but do you think that some sort of habitual tendency to dishonesty erodes the sort of integrity of the personality in such a way that that creates an impediment to spiritual progress?
Yes, I would say it's a way of hiding.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're honest, you'll start seeing stuff. Like I said, I used to hide from my father that way. That was one of the scariest things. That was shortly after I read that book, and I was in the mentor program at the time. So a lot of this, there's a lot going on. There was a stage in my life where I felt moved intuitively, completely intuitively. I had no idea why. I moved to Las Vegas. Mm-hmm. Why? I don't know. I mean, get into that, but I could feel it. It was true, and my mind was like, yeah, but no. And finally, it was so painful to resist it. I said, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to listen. I'm going to do it. Why? I don't know. But when I had lunch with my father, and this is the last time I actually lived in my hometown. I left. I never went back after this. It was important. I mean, I visited, but I didn't live there after that. Anyway, so we're having lunch, and I said, Dad, and it was hard to do to say this, but I said, Dad, I'm moving to Las Vegas because God wants me to. And you know what he did? He had this thing where he'd go like this, oh no, over his food, like,
put his head in his hand, yeah.
Yeah, and I was like, part of me was scared, but I did it, and took courage, and then he said, oh well, we'll deal with it, we'll work it out. I'm like, wow, that was easy, actually, you know what I mean? It's like we tend to hide, so that opened up all kind of stuff for me. If you can be honest with your parents, it's hard to do, but
Yeah.
And I'll add one more thing.
Ram Dass said that if you think you're enlightened, go spend a week with your parents.
Exactly. Go home for the holidays. You think you're awake? Go home for the holidays.
Yeah.
And yeah, it can be fun. It can be unpleasant. It can be happy. It's all kind of stuff. But basically, you love them, and that's the basis. Mm-hmm. But there's one more level of honesty that I'll get to real quick, which I call absolute honesty, and that's just a term, but basically what it means, it's basically what meditation is. It's what consciousness is. So there's telling the truth, and then there's knowing when and where and to whom, right? You get that straightened out. Then you have thoughts arising. Absolute honesty is seeing that no thought is absolutely true. And so again, I'm making this gesture. It's like thoughts arise, and what do we usually do? Ego's like, oh, some form of, I don't want this, or I do want that, and it's like this narcissist thing, in our thoughts. But conscious process where you're in meditation, thought arises, and you just see it as empty. You see it as, it may have relative truth, but it doesn't have any absolute truth. And I think that's important. So that's
yeah. That's really.
And if you're lying, I think if you're lying habitually, I don't think you can really do that. I don't think you can get to the place where you just clearly witness your thoughts arise because you're too busy hiding. So yeah, you have to get it straightened out.
You're creating some kind of deep complexity in your structure that is not conducive to resting as in the simplest form of awareness.
Right.
Yeah, and it's worth adding that there's a lot of, again, in the Vedic literature at least, there's a lot of emphasis on that. There are people who are so much into their honesty that if they say something, they have to do it no matter what. Like Ramana, not Ramana, Ram in the Ramayana, he committed to going to the forest, and so I had to do it. He had to do it because he couldn't go back on his word. Or in the Mahabharata, the Pandavas, the 5 brothers, brought home this woman that they had found on their journeys or whatever, and they said, hey Mom, look what we brought home, and their mother's in the kitchen. She said, well, whatever it is, share it equally among you. And it was this woman. So she became the wife of all five because her mother they couldn't disobey their mother. She had said it, it had to be.
There you go. Yeah.
They had other wives too, in addition to one. Okay, so enough on honesty. Incidentally, those who are listening, and there's about 140 of them now or something, if you have a question that you'd like to ask, there's a question forum on the bottom of the upcoming interviews page on batgap.com. Second of your points is study, and you touched upon this earlier, and
it's like letting the meaning penetrate the words. There's a deeper meaning, to the degree that a text was written from a place of consciousness. So, whatever that is. So it could be someone who's awake or someone who just is very conscious, either way. And again, is honest. So it builds on the first chapter. So it's basically honest, and there's a degree of consciousness coming through.
Yeah. And when you say study, do you mean like studying spiritual teachings and texts and things like that? Is that what you're saying?
Is basically what it is, right? And I talk about that. There's there's a relative and an absolute value, and so in Tibetan Buddhism they call this the two truths. Okay, so there's really only one reality, one truth. We know that. But there's this relative appearance, and so we're dealing with that. That's Rick, would you pass me the water? That's the relative truth. Absolute truth is Brahman, right? It's I am that. So you're reading for, if you're reading for entertainment, like a novel, you're just reading. It's basically relative level. There's some feelings, emotions you might have. If you're reading a spiritual text, say you're reading Crest-Jewel Discrimination, which is fantastic, by the way, if no one's read that. Shankara. As you penetrate it, it'll penetrate you, in a sense. Sounds funny, maybe, but there's a depth of it. That's like I said, Franklin Merrill Wolff was studying, forget what he was reading when he woke up at first. It was a commentary. He wrote a lot of commentaries on the Upanishads. But
Franklin did, or Shankara did?
Shankara wrote a lot of commentaries on the Upanishads. But say like Crest-Jewel, for example, it's really clear philosophically, and that's important, that relative level of just clarity of thinking, and yet there's a depth because of who's writing it and from which place it's being written. And they're both going on at the same time. So actually it's a form of meditation. Yeah.
I guess my thought on study is that it's that spiritual progress, or if you want to call it that, definitely has a knowledge component as well as an experience component. And without the knowledge, experience can be misinterpreted. One can have an awakening, and it can be a source of confusion and fear if one doesn't know what it is. I mean, you yourself said when you first awoke, you didn't know what this was, and also, too much study without the experiential component can get lopsided. You can just get all hung up in intellectual ideas and mistake those for actual realization or experience. So, but there's a kind of a step-by-step process where it's nice if knowledge and experience can go hand in hand, I think.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
That's basically what Chapter 2 is about.
Right, good. Okay, and instruction is sort of a natural follow-up from study. I guess it's like you're getting some guidance from an actual person rather than just trying to figure it out on your own from a book.
Right, I would call that just as, look, these are just conventions, so let's not get hung up on it. But I call level one is you're studying. You haven't literally met an awakened teacher in person. It's very different. I met Richard, and when I first met him, that's a different. It is a different quality. They're both important. So I'm going to say one more thing about study before we abandon it. It's not just text; it's also videos. So
sure, in this day and age,
you're watching.
Yeah.
Well, YouTube is really useful, and there's a way of listening within yourself as you're hearing this conversation, for example. And you're right. It's there's an intellectual component, and there's an awareness component that has a depth to it. Yeah. So Chapter 3, instruction. I know that there's some disagreement sometimes about whether a teacher is necessary. I would say really what happens, we have an inner teacher. I usually capitalize the term. Like you have your school teacher from 3rd grade. That's lowercase t, fine. Unless you happen to be awake. No, I'm kidding. That'd be kind of cool, wouldn't it? Your third grade teacher is a awakened
Yeah, that'd
guy.
be great.
Yeah, but anyway, I don't think mine was. Anyway, sorry, Mrs. Stewart. Anyway, so yeah, so it's an inner capacity we all have for awakening, and they say when the student is ready, the master appears or something. That's what it's like. It's as if it's like it appears outside you, but it's not. Like if this is a dream and you're trying to wake up from the dream, you're like, oh, I really want to wake up. I'm really sincere. Get honest. Do some study. The teacher appears. Mm-hmm. When I found Richard's book, The Eye That Is We, his first book, it was random. I thought it was someone else. There's a guy named Rick Moss who did some kind of work in Texas, like in Austin.
Yeah, I knew him actually. He was an old TM teacher back in the day.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Yeah, I'd seen him present, and I'm like, oh, cool. He wrote a book, and it said Richard Moss, Richard. Pull it off the shelf. I opened to page 1. I'm like, whoa, what is this? And really, frankly, a transmission, just bodily, oh my gosh. And I just devoured it and so on. Like, what made that appear? Was it random? I don't know, but I think that if you're ready and you're sincere, help will come.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've spoken to people who, they walk into a bookstore and they're walking down the aisle and a book falls on the floor. They pick it up and it's Ramana. It's like,
right?
What's going on?
Yeah. So is a teacher necessary? Well, no, not really. I mean, look at Eckhart Tolle. Well, it's spontaneous, right? I don't think he.
Somebody told me he had a lot more seeking phase before his awakening than he lets on in The Power of Now, but who knows?
Yeah, I think he was an intellectual. He talks about that. He was a student, university student in England. But yeah, I mean, who knows? I'm just saying that what I would say, and I touched on this earlier, but the basic thing is that having a teacher makes it easier.
Yeah.
Like, why not avail yourself of that help? It does not mean, now, find someone, I write about this. It is really important to discern true from false. It's just how it is. I mean, look at Jim Jones. I mean, do I need to say any more? Like, just don't go there. But, there may be more subtle forms of that. And just, basically, you have to listen within yourself. And if you're honest and you studied, it is a process that, like, you get a certain degree of clarity and you learn. It's almost like a flavor. It's not a taste. Like, this is true. This is real. Yes, you get that, but then you don't check your intellect at the door. You continue to participate, and it takes a lot of trust.
Yeah.
And if signs of abuse come up, which you mentioned, someone, get out of there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got an email from somebody recently who said basically, you interview all these bozos, and none of them are enlightened. Why haven't you interviewed my teacher? My teacher is really enlightened. And I don't know about that person's teacher, but my attitude in doing this is that everybody's a work in progress. I don't know if anybody is ultimately finished, but in this day and age, it does seem, as Thich Nhat Hanh said, that the Buddha is the Sangha. That there are hundreds and hundreds of spiritual teachers all doing their thing, and
it's backgammon.
And most of them, it's backgammon. And most of them have something to offer to people who resonate with them. And, somebody might totally resonate with you. Others I don't get this guy. I'm not interested. Fine. Then you have your niche. You have your affinity group. And I think that's kind of true of all the people I interview. And some might stay with a teacher for a long time. Others might, hopscotch a bit from one to the next, and as long as they're not being a dilettante and just dabbling and not really going deep with somebody, but really, all right, this guy's taught me everything I need to know, I'm going to move on. I think that somehow in this day and age, that's the nature of it,
Well, you mentioned Adi Dai. I don't want to get into that too much, but when I read Method of the Siddhas, his first book, it really affected me. I mean, it's very powerful, I thought. We might disagree on whether, it's quality or so on, but I will say that the community around him was a bit strange, and I don't mean any disrespect to him. It's just, I don't know, it didn't feel right, and so I write about that in this chapter, that you can sort of investigate and see what it's about, and then if it's not for you, you can respectfully back away.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to go online and, start a flame war about it. Just, it's not for you. It's fine. No disrespect. And then, that's when I found I That Is We, maybe a couple of years later. And Richard just worked for me, basically.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I've interviewed a number of people who were with him. Samuel Bonder, who was one of his top people, Sandra Glickman, Mercedes Kirkle, probably a few more. Terry Patton was with him for a long time. And, they all have laudable qualities. They all obviously grew and gained something, but he himself he really don't want to get into it. It's just,
yeah, let's not go there.
We could get into horror stories. So,
chapter 4.
Yeah, chapter 4. Action.
Yeah, action. I could just start anywhere. So, is there a doer? No. Rick, would you hand me the water? Yes. It's like they're both true.
Yeah.
So, I mean, a lot of this, I just would say that from basically the absolute, or say it's just a conscious perspective. Let's say you're a student and you're working on this. You're becoming more conscious. You start to see through ego. You start to relax a little bit. And then you could say there's just beingness. We mentioned happiness. Yeah, you're happier. You're like, wow, cool. And maybe you're sad, and you're like, oh, sadness is kind of interesting too, and you're just a little more loose, and like, hand me the glass of water, it's not a problem, and like if you're embracing dualism, for example, I mean, if you want to, it's going to be unpleasant. Like, if you're attached to a thought that disagrees with reality, you're going to feel it. So you don't have to go around, wondering if things are dualistic or not. I mean, they're basically not. That's the premise. All is one. The world is a mirage or something. But I mean, it's like you're in a bad dream and you're trying to wake up from it. Well, if you're in the dream, it's scary and painful. As you start to wake up, it's like, yeah, and you start, it changes. So, no, there's not a doer, and yet, I don't know. I know I've heard it said there's no doer. Great. Just don't make that a dogma. Right? It's like, pass the salt. It's not that big a deal.
I think there's a levels thing, like we were talking about earlier, where there's a level at which there's no doer, there's a level at which there's a doer. Both are true simultaneously. I mean, taking the Gita as a case in point. Half the book is Krishna exhorting Arjuna to get up off his butt and fight. And, I want you to do this. And yet there's whole chapters about how, the self-realized person realizes, I do not act at all. The gunas of nature are performing action. It's not essentially who I am that is the actor. And then they'll throw in a verse like, you have control over action alone, never over its fruits. So that kind of goes back and forth between those perspectives. And I think the only kind of resolution is that in the bigger picture, both are true, and you have to sort of render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and if there's a sense of performing action and doership, then honor that on its own level. But if there's also simultaneously a sense that I do not act at all, then that's also true. They're not mutually exclusive.
Like when I hear you speak, for example, I'm hearing, honestly, I'm not trying to flatter you, it sounds like there's a clarity, like you've obviously thought about this, you've obviously studied, and there's a certain wisdom that comes through based on your experience and honesty and so on, like an intellectual honesty, and you admit when you don't know things, and we're having this conversation, and I forget what I was going to say about that. It's like, is there a doer? I don't know, but you're in a sense transmitting a conscious position. Where you can get yourself out of the way. You are, Rick. I mean, I'm saying, like I said, there's a degree of consciousness that I'm hearing that really isn't about you. That's what I'm trying to say. And yet there's a humility where you're like, yeah, I've had this experience in that, and then it is both, but it becomes less intellectual and more about how we live, and like the quality of your presence. And there's an intellectual precision to what you say, and I try to do that too. I'm not always good at it. there's also a presence, and it just kind of like you get self out of the way a little, and you know what I mean? It's more honest, and then there's a connection. There's some kind of, we all want that.
Yeah.
I would say we want connection. There's a lot of loneliness, and so we listen to each other differently. We're listening into the being, and then like, is there a doer? I don't know, man. Pass the salt. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now, if you throw it in my head, I might duck, but otherwise, yeah, pass the salt.
Yeah. I mean, my own orientation is just that I've, you know, ever since I was a teenager, I've really been lit up by this stuff and have had my attention on it. And I kind of have this inclusive attitude of all the various components, the intellectual understanding, the experience, the morality, all these different things are important components, and you can't take any of them in isolation or to the exclusion of the others. And I very much consider myself a work in progress. You see a picture of Amma over my shoulder. She often says we should always have the attitude of a beginner. I've heard Adya say that too. So
I feel that.
Yeah, I kind of feel that. It's like, and it's, I think it's literally true, not just a sort of a little intellectual safeguard, but relative to beings who may exist in this universe and levels of spiritual development that might be possible. We are all relative beginners. So, I don't know,
like, I don't know how to play the bagpipes. I'm sure if I tried, it would be terrible.
Yeah.
But you know, you got to start somewhere, right?
Sure. And even in the realm of spirituality, that's why I kind of, I'm a little bit, there's two things that bug me. One is people who say they're done, and you know, and they're kind of adamant about that. And another is people who take opinions as absolute truths. Like they might have a certain attitude about teachers or about some particular thing, and it's like, this is the way it is, you know, and it's not like this is my perspective and maybe another perspective would be equally valid, but you know, this is the truth. I think that's a kind of a boxed in way of living.
It could be. I guess the key is not to be one of those people, right?
Yeah, and in describing them, not to become one.
Yeah, I will say for your first point there that I do in my book, and again, I was definitely, when I wrote that, it was like at least 10 years ago. It was definitely more. I was more in the mountaintop perspective, which is fine, and the book is really about, you know, you're in the valley and you want to get to the peak. Mm-hmm. After that, I don't say a whole lot about it. Maybe a little. I feel like whatever I write from here on out, I'll probably address that. Maybe. But I want to live it first, right? I do stress that when you're done, you're done. Mm-hmm. But really the question is who's done. And I don't mean to play a little semantic.
And what's done? What do we mean by done?
Suffering. I mean, ego. Let's just call it ego. Ego dies. Mm-hmm. Now, I could almost hear Richard like, oh, you know, like my dad, like, oh, no. No, I don't know what he'd think of that. But no, self, okay, here's the thing. This is really important. I've heard misunderstandings. Self, there's still a self. It's just seen as a, you know, like a phantom or a mirage. It is, like if I made a shadow puppet, I don't have a light, and I'm not good at shadow puppets, but if I made, say, like a bunny on the wall or a duck or something, mm-hmm. I could say, hey, Rick, do you see the bunny? You'd be like, yeah, I see it. But there's no bunny. So there both is and is not a bunny. And it's a concept. It's sort of like when you're watching a movie, like, whoa, did you see that? You know, that guy got shot or something. Like, yeah. I'm like, but is that real? You're like, no. You know, so you entertain disbelief. I mean, what do you suspend disbelief? And yeah, but so when ego's not there, so if ego is it's like an addiction. So an addict isn't free, right? An addiction is defined as a compulsive behavior, like such as a use of a substance or gambling or something like that. It's compulsive despite negative consequences. That's the textbook definition. And you can't stop. It's compulsive and you need help. Ego's like that. Basically, it's similar. It's a compulsive attachment to self. Self-importance. It could be big self, small self. Look at me, I'm important, or oh, I'm insignificant. They're both false. And what happens is they awaken perspective. Again, the mudra is like from just freedom. It's like, it is. Is it true? No. I mean, is it relatively true? Sure, why not? Why? Because I'm talking to Rick. It's compassion. It's connection. It's freedom as it's lived in the world. Mm. It's like, let's do this together. let's do this. At the same time, it's like, yeah, none of that's real. And that's what gives you the freedom to, it doesn't matter what you do. I mean, that sounds terrible. There is a morality about it. It's like, it doesn't matter, and yet I find that the kindness, generosity, and those sort of virtues that we tend to talk about are natural.
You're leading into something here that
Yeah.
I was going to say based on this done point, which is
Right.
that, like you mentioned, well, I can't play the bagpipes.
Right. Yeah.
But obviously that is a very tangential sort of skill and not something that everyone in the world needs to learn. Thank God. I mean, it would be quite cacophony if they all did.
Right.
But there are certain qualities.
We're all doing that metaphorically, aren't we?
There are certain qualities that we associate with spiritual development and have been historically associated with it, like you just mentioned a couple, kindness and compassion. And I would like to think that that though there are certain qualities like that aside from awareness or realization of truth or self, that are important components of spiritual development, and that there always may be exceptions and variations and so on and so forth, but that once that ground has been established of being, that it's going to begin to percolate into various aspects of the personality, and one might find that the heart becomes more and more and more full and blossomed, and compassion and love and devotion and qualities like that begin to grow, or that the senses begin to become more refined and subtle and in their appreciation of everything, or that behavior begins to become more helpful and compassionate and so on. I don't know. Those are qualities that, and I've heard people argue the opposite. I've heard them say that there's no correlation between spiritual awakening and behavior, and all that behavior could be very crude and cruel and rough, and yet one could be awakened. But I really just question whether that's fully true, whether there might not be higher values to awakening that are being missed there.
That's a really good point. I would say it's about connection.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if I'm a jerk, you're probably going to tune me out. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm a jerk and you're still listening. I don't know. But I mean, that's the nature of self. It's like the fool in the tarot deck, like just stepping off a cliff. Ooh, it doesn't know anything. Yeah, if I'm a jerk, who cares if I'm awake or not? You're probably going to tune me out. So I try to, and it's interesting, like, would I be a good or moral person or a kind person, like, for a purpose? Yeah, because freedom. It is the foundation, for me anyway, it's the foundation of all of that. So, I mean, that's part of why the relative is called relative, because it relates. Mm-hmm. So, like, passing me the salt, that's a relationship, right? That is a certain, object relations, whatever. What's it for? Like, what is the world for? I tend to say it doesn't have an absolute value, it has a relative value. But what's interesting is if you use it, say you use what you have in the world to wake up, it changes everything. Because, like, say you have a pencil, it's just this absurd object, right? If you can write with it. Well, I journaled for a long time. I mentioned William Samuel. He got me into that. I kept a journal for 12 years. I mean, that was really important work. And so I used into Camus, but
no.
The Jones too.
Yeah, I was going to mention her name in case people want to find out more about William Samuel. I did an interview with Sandy Jones, which you can look up on Batgap. But
she endorsed my book.
Oh, good.
By the way,
nice.
Just a little tidbit there.
Yeah. Okay, we may have covered the point, but I guess the point I wanted to make is you say, if I'm a jerk, you're going to tune me out. My question would be, if you're a jerk, if you're behaving like a jerk, not that there's any absolute universal criteria of jerkiness, but
we all kind of know what it is.
Yeah, but
and if you don't know, then you're the jerk. Right?
Then is that really representative of the full value of awakening, or would that indicate a sort of a half-baked or partial stage of development, and that there's more potential there for development.
That's a good question.
And you asked about what is the purpose of the world, or what is the purpose of existence, or something like that. I mean, some people like to think of it in terms of that evolution of consciousness, development of awareness is the purpose, and that the universe is one big giant evolution machine, so to speak. And if that is the case, or, you know, speaking just hypothetically, we could discuss it more, but then it would seem to me that someone who is really awakened has kind of merged with or discovered their essential identity with that intelligence which is intrinsic to and is governing the creation, and it has really become a servant of that. And many people have spoken that way, that they've become a servant of the divine. You know, Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace, St. Francis. So, you know, if you're really serving the divine, of course the divine likes to blow up planets by crashing asteroids into them and stuff like that too. But there's a kind of a, who was it? Stephen Colbert said that the truth has a liberal bias. I think that that the universe has an evolutionary bias in terms of promoting and facilitating greater and greater expression of its essential nature, the divine nature, and the awakened person becomes a servant of that, ideally. And if they're not a servant of that, if they seem to be serving something in opposition to that, then maybe further awakening is desired.
Yeah, I'd say that, like, the event that I'm calling awakening definitely is a thing, and then self is seen as empty, and at the same time, like, I'm constantly improving and growing.
Yeah.
But when I say I'm talking about the person, the dude,
right.
like
the
one that would hand you
expression.
the one that hands you the salt,
Right.
whatever that is. Like, hey, let's hang out. Like, if I'm, you know, just transparent being with no, you know, what am I going to do? It's like, you know, we do things. You know, I like to hike, I like to ski, I like to go and have a beer, I like to be with people, I like to do this work. And there is a sense of self that's there. It's just, it's empty, right? So every object in the universe is like that. It isn't ultimately real or true, but it has a relative truth. And again, it's about connecting. It's about relationship. It's about connecting.
Good.
So the better I can be in that respect, I think the more I'm able to connect with others. And I mean, I think we're all jerks to some degree. Everything's awkward. I mean, the self just doesn't know what to do. Like I said, it's like the fool. It's in the tarot deck. Just, there's such a humility about it. And I'm constantly surrendering myself to not knowing, what I call not knowing. Just, I don't know. And yet there's a beingness that it doesn't know conceptually, because that has nothing to do with it, because thoughts aren't true. It's what Franklin Mara Wolf called knowledge through identity. It's I am. You know, like, does a river know how to flow, or does it just flow? It doesn't think. It just is, and it's perfect. It's just, you know, so Taoism just, I think morality is part of that. I feel at least for me personally, which is probably the most honest thing to say, is that I really do try to be a decent human being.
Sure.
Do I always succeed? No. Just ask Ali. I mean, I can be abrasive, I can be rude, I can interrupt. I mean, I've interrupted you a couple of times, but I try not to.
No, you're doing okay. You know what you said about not really knowing. I keep quoting the Gita a lot. Some people don't like that, but I happen to know at least the first 6 chapters. But there's a verse which says, "Unfathomable is the course of action," and the implication there is that the intricacies and the ramifications and of any action are so complex that they're beyond the grasp of human intellect. And what is advised is to sort of get in tune with or merge with that intelligence which does permeate and orchestrate the whole thing, and then spontaneously action will be performed with the sort of skill which you might have if you did actually know all the ramifications, even though you're incapable of it.
I agree. I agree. What comes to me is darkness is just as light, and light is just as dark as darkness. You know, yin and yang, as soon as you think you know what it is, it isn't. It is purely movement or stillness. what is it Jesus says? What's the sign of the kingdom of a movement within stillness or something? I don't know. I read this, I think Gospel of Thomas maybe, but it's interesting. It's an absolute consciousness that includes, it's hard to say this, frankly, for me, but it includes genocide. How do you reconcile that? I don't know. We're working on it. Like, you know what? I try not to be a genocidal maniac. That's my job. You know, and through doing Katie's work, it is radical if you really get into it. The turnaround that she has, like, for example, people shouldn't judge. That's your thought. Well,
but they do.
First of all, people do judge, so it's not true. I mean, it's all we do. Like, it's just everywhere, judgments.
Yeah.
But then it turns around, like, I shouldn't judge. Oh, wait, I'm doing that. It's like the problem is littering, and everyone's strewing garbage everywhere, and you're like, that's terrible, and yet you're doing it too.
Yeah.
Like, you got to stop. You know, I mean, it just stop, clean up your part of it. You know.
And decide what
the other
team you
turnaround
want to be on.
is, so it's I shouldn't judge. I mean, I shouldn't judge, and then there's yeah, I don't want to get into that. You go ahead.
I was just going to say, you kind of choose what team you want to be on. Do you want to be on the genocide team? Do you want to be the guy who drove the car into the crowd in Charlottesville? Or do you want to serve a higher purpose? You know,
yeah.
All is well and wisely put, and it takes all types to make a universe. But, you know, where do you want to affiliate? You know, and
Yeah.
what is the experience of your life going to be like based upon with, you know, whom you associate with, whom you affiliate with, the kinds of actions you do. You choose, you know. Yeah.
I mean, it's an ongoing process. That part doesn't, it just keeps, Richard talks, you know, in your interview, I watched it, and I feel that he's a wonderful teacher. I mean, again, I don't mean to flatter anyone, but, you know, he is. And I'm just glad that he taught me that stuff, you know. I don't know what I'd be like personally if I hadn't, I mean, I don't know if I'd even be here, like, talking to you. But I think he mirrors a certain social responsibility and sort of a grace and dignity that we can all understand, and that's part of it. And yet so is the jerkiness. You got to have a little of that, right? I mean, it's part of the spice of what we're doing. Mm-hmm. If it's held consciously, it's not a problem. That's the thing. In my book, I noticed to say a lot about, like, anger. In Buddhism, they're like, well, anger and certainly rage, fear. These are like afflictions, I think. You know, they're problems, and they are. But if they're held consciously, it doesn't matter. I mean, you can actually, like, be passionate, and it's not a problem.
Yeah, I think it depends on, you know, I mean, how much you indulge, and also whether you use spirituality as an alibi for misbehavior, which I've seen people do.
That doesn't happen, does it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know.
So I try to be a decent person. That's what I try to do.
Yeah. I mean, I've actually, somebody was telling me the other day about somebody in our town, maybe there's more than one, who have done all kinds of scurrilous business things, and, you know, when they're called on it, it's more like, oh, it's not, I'm not the doer, I'm not the actor, you know, it's just all, you know, the gunas of nature carrying this out. And so they're using...
Tell that to the judge.
Yeah, right, exactly. They're using spirituality as an alibi for misbehavior.
Yeah, I hear that. I don't know if I do that. I try not to.
Yeah.
I might have. It is convenient, you know, but it's just not. Talk about being a jerk. I mean, yeah, I try to take responsibility for all that and not do that.
Okay, now there's about 5 more points in your book, and if we spend 10 or 15 minutes on each one, we're going to go way over time, so we can't.
Okay, lightning round.
Yeah, so it's like, you know, commitment, embodiment, meditation, community, life, devotion. All right, thank you. So commitment, and let's just spend like a lightning round, like you say.
Sure. Commitment. I talk about the Bodhisattva vow. Again, I'm not a Buddhist, but it's important, and it's in the middle of the book because you're at the point. At that point in the process, it's going from a level 2 to a 3 where you're committed.
Committed to the practice, to the path.
We're talking about commitment, right? It's chapter 5. Yeah. You're committed. No, you're committed to. I call it the path of awakening, which might sound kind of lame, but it is what it is. Yeah, I mean, yeah. So there's actually a vow that one takes. Franklin Merrill Wolf took it. Richard took it, and Richard, fortunately, allowed me to take it in Yosemite Valley.
And the
Places
vow
like that.
is?
It is beautiful. I mean, I'm telling you. And there's a certain ripeness or maturity for that to occur. And it's really important. I talk about it in the book. But it's necessary to get past that point, so to speak.
And what was the vow?
I don't have it memorized. It's in the book.
Oh, and what was the gist of it? What were you committing to?
It's like may all beings. What is it? It's funny, I can't remember it, but it's basically like
the Bodhisattva vow kind of
thing. I think Richard calls it the Kuan Yin vow because right. But he gave it to me, so it's it's in the book. It's like may all beings be free. Like basically, I'm going to stay behind until all beings are free.
Yeah.
And we could get into what that means, and but it's more of the spirit of it. More of the spirit. I mean, Jesus says, "He who is last shall be first, and first last, and all that." So there's some of that.
Someone told Ramana about the Bodhisattva vow, and he laughed and he said, "That's like saying I'm not going to wake up from this dream until everybody else wakes up from this dream."
I can see that perspective, and yet if Richard had said, "We want you to stack this pile of rocks, and then take it down and stack it over there, and do that for 10 years," I would have done it. And then we could get into what that means, but it's like there's a certain degree of transmission that's going on.
Yeah.
Chapter 6.
Embodiment. We've already talked about that a little bit.
Embodiment, Richard's, I don't know, at the beginning of that chapter, it's funny, I have two quotes. I contrast Shankara with Walt Whitman. Like, say, which one of these is true? Shankara says the body is like a bag of bones and filth, and it's worthy of our contempt. And, whoa, and yes to that. And then
Whitman.
Well, Whitman, says
praise the body electric.
I sing the body electric.
Sing the body electric, right?
The armies of those I love engirth me, and I engirth them, and I shall not go off until I discorrupt them and charge them full with the charge of the soul. That's a paraphrase. I may have botched it, but they're both true. And if you read the book, it'll make sense.
Okay, great. Meditation.
I will say that I do a lot of embodiment, moving meditation in my retreats. And it's wonderful, and it's awesome, and it works. We do sitting too, but if your body isn't awake, then you're not awake. That's just, I'm asserting that without defending it, but that's how it is.
Sure, people can learn more.
Chapter 7, meditation. I really cover the different forms of meditation. Mindfulness, inquiry, prayer. They're all different takes on the same process that I call conscious relationship.
Okay.
And
you teach some forms of meditation on your retreats and stuff.
Totally. Yeah. And it's pretty simple. I try to keep it simple because if it's complex, you'll forget it and you won't do it. But one of the main points I make at the beginning of that chapter is that meditation practice and meditation itself are not the same thing. And again, I can't get into it. I kind of want to, but meditation is the relationship of the formless with form. And it is already. So practice is just waking up to that.
Okay, good. Community.
Basically, so working with a group magnifies, if you do it, again, it's important to have a good teacher. And to have, there's a section in there literally called Avoiding Cults. So check that out. I mean, I have no interest in anything, remotely related to what looks like an authoritarian, I can't even talk, an authoritarian deal. But I wrote about it there. That being said, getting a group together and invoking that presence through these practices, it greatly magnifies the presence. You were saying something about the Sangha is the, what did you say?
Thich Nhat Hanh, the famous Buddhist Zen master, said the next Buddha may be the Sangha. In other words, we're not going to be waiting for some great big superstar or savior type guy, but just the Sangha, the collective, the groups that we form can be our teacher.
Yeah, that's basically what that is.
Yeah.
Chapter 9 is called Life, and that is really, it's about just living this in the world. Living, you're a student, you've made all this progress, and you're getting closer maybe, and yes, it sounds linear, and that's how it is. So it's living it. Part of
to be apologetic for linear, I don't think. I mean,
yeah, I guess
spiritual development is linear. I've yet to find anyone who hasn't progressed through various stages.
Okay, so remember, so I was saying, so you have like your party self and your strict spiritual self, and it's just live it, just
Yeah.
live it. Be a decent human being and like deal with your parents. Do home for the holidays kind of stuff. How do you do? That's really what that's about. And then chapter 10, devotion is, it's written. I will say it's written. I really like that chapter, but it's written with it's as close as I could get to that sense of formlessness and what that's like, and to put it into words. And frankly, it sounds a bit, I almost want to say apocalyptic, which, I mean, viewers may be like, what? But basically, so you're talking about ego death. You're talking about, if you read, it's in the literature, like the world ends, the universe ceases to exist. Self, ego, I think if you don't understand that that's where it's going, at least conceptually, like, okay, that's what it's like, then to me, it felt dishonest not to put that in there. That being said, I don't know, just read it and see what you think. But it's like, part of it is like, you're done, it's over, it's ended, like you were saying. If I were to write something now, it would probably include more about like, okay, what's it like after that? It just kind of ends. It's like formlessness. So I would say that was honest when I wrote it, and it still is, as long as you understand, okay, that's what it's like, and then you wash the dishes,
Yeah.
So.
Let me dwell on this for a bit, because I don't yet understand why you would associate a word like apocalyptic with devotion. But all the great non-dual teachers that we talk about, like Shankara, Ramana, Nisargadatta, Papaji, many others, they're all extremely devotional characters. Shankara wrote all this beautiful devotional poetry and was devoted to Durga, I believe, and Ramakrishna to Kali, and Ramana to Shiva in the form of Arunachala, and Papaji to his teacher, and Nisargadatta to his teacher, and they were always doing pujas and singing bhajans and prostrating to the floor and all this stuff. So there's no, at least in the examples of these people, there's no incompatibility between non-dual realization and devotion. And in fact, it would almost seem that non-dual realization provides a context or a platform in which devotion can really soar. So how does that relate to what you're saying here?
What did I say, apocalyptic?
You did say that. I wasn't sure why.
Yeah, good question. Because it ends your nightmare.
Oh, so in a good sense, then it's apocalyptic. It's like the end of the nightmare.
Well, yeah, we all, isn't the last, I'm really not a Bible scholar, but isn't the last book in the Bible
Revelations? Yeah, but that all sounds like fire and brimstone, and
I know.
All the sinners being cast into the fire and all that jazz.
How many cults have there been or continue to be where they're just like praying for the end of the world? It's like, it's wicked, it's sinful. It's like, I wouldn't say all those things, but I would say there is some kind of understanding that the spiritual path has to do with like ending that, and if you read, say, Shankara, I mean, he's really clear about it. He's like, it's done. The world ends. And of course, I've said that embracing the relative continues. So it's just empty. So there's that. But that's why I said apocalyptic, because devotion to me is the purest. It's basically love of truth with a capital T. It's where you love. Remember when I said I was doing the work of Byron Katie, and I'm like, wow, I love this. Like, I just felt good. I felt happy, but more than happy, more freedom, more just, I don't know, consciousness, and if to fall in love with that is, I would say that's the most potent weapon you have in the war against falsehood. Now, it's funny because these militaristic images, but I mean, Whitman says, the armies of those I love engirth me and I girth them. The armies, there's something about, there's a fierce, there's a determination. It's like devotion means giving everything. Give it all you've got. And you know what? You're next. It feels like you're being undermined. It feels, but it's ego, but man, it feels like you. It's like, so not you, Rick, but just in general, it feels like devotion to me, I felt that. And that's what helped me across that threshold I was talking about. So ego death, like what do you let go into? I talk about faith. Faith isn't a belief. It's a relationship with the formless. It's just complete unknowing. But yet devotion draws you forward. And man, there's no control. No one, it's love of that which is. That's it. And so it's at the end of the book, because if you start out with that, the ego's probably going to co-opt it and you'll end up, I don't know doing what, but watch out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It could become an obsession with, devotion. It's poorly understood, but in our culture anyway, maybe not in India, but it's important to develop a certain discernment, I think, before you get to that point, and that's why it's at the end. But I mean, if you could skip to devotion, do that.
I think devotion needs to have a foundation in terms of self-realization, because if you don't know who you are, then who is going to be devoted to what? There's Maharishi used to say that a small pond can't rise up in big tidal waves without stirring up the mud at the bottom, and by the same token, unless there's that foundation of being, then the heart can't rise in great waves of devotion, because it just doesn't have the foundation or the depth or the capacity to do so.
Yeah. So I wrote it that way because it I mean, you could just read it. I'm just saying, like, hearing you say that, like, it kind of bothers you when people say, well, I'm done, it's over. I do kind of say that.
It doesn't bother me that much. It's just sort of like, really, man?
Right. I mean, we could still pass the salt and hang out, and it's over. So it's both. And I want people hearing this to hear that. And the heart of it is really compassion, I think. I mean, if you love people, love beings, and you want, like, let's do this, Let's do it.
Okay, good. Well, we've covered a lot. This has been a good conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I knew it would be, just listening to your talks and whatnot, that you're an articulate guy, and you've put a lot of thought into this stuff and taken it very seriously, and I had a feeling we'd have an interesting conversation, which we have.
Thank you.
Good. Okay, so let me wrap it up. I've been speaking with James Wood, and I'll be linking, as always, to James. I always create a page for each person, and say a little bit about them, link to their website and stuff. So James's website is jameswoodteachings.com, and I'll be linking to that. And you can go there and find out what James has to offer and get in touch with him. As you know, probably this is an ongoing series. And if you would like to, check out previous ones or be notified of future ones, or subscribe to the audio podcast, or donate, or see who is scheduled in the coming months or whatever, go to batgap.com and just check out the appropriate menus to do those things. So thanks for listening or watching. Next week, as I mentioned, will be, I didn't mention her name, it'll be Glory G, who is this woman who owned a biker bar and was a bartender and had some horrific experiences and ended up sort of literally on her knees, and then the light broke through. So I think she's going to be really interesting. So thanks, James. Pardon?
Yeah, I'll say one thing of a practical nature, that we got a new website recently, and that we're really adding more content to it.
Okay.
If people are wondering, like, what can they do? One thing you can do is get on our mailing list, and we won't spam you, but we'll let you know about upcoming retreats and things like that.
Yeah.
So jameswoodteachings.com. Yeah.
Good.
And you get a free download of chapter 1 of 10 Paths.
Okay, great.
So, yeah, it's worth it.
And I don't spam you either. I mean, if you sign up to be notified of each new interview, you get basically one email a week. We don't use the list for anything else. So great. Thanks for listening or watching, everybody, and we'll see you next week. And thanks again, James. Have a good life. We'll be in touch.
Thanks, you too. Hope to see you again.
Yeah, you too. Me too.